Shadows in the Mansion, Alone Together, Part 3. Once they finished eating, Nasha gathered the plates and set them in the sink before returning to her seat across from Obasi. Her movements were careful, her posture straight but overly stiff, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Obasi noticed the effort behind her composure, the attempt to appear at ease, though her twisting fingers betrayed her unease. Sensing her tension, he decided to break the silence. "It was good," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but genuine. Her gaze flicked to him briefly, before dropping to her hands. "It was nothing special," she murmured, her voice subdued. "No," he countered softly. "It's the best sandwich I've had in a long time." His dark eyes stayed on her, the corners of his lips lifting slightly. "Whatever you put into it speaks of the skill of a chef." Her fingers stilled, and for the first time she looked up at him fully. Their eyes met, and he saw a flicker of surprise in her gaze. The words seemed to catch her off guard, as though she wasn't used to praise, or perhaps hadn't expected it from him. She hesitated before replying, her voice quieter still. "Yes," she said softly. "My mother taught me to cook many things." "Really?" Obasi leaned forward slightly, the genuine interest in his tone barely masked by his calm demeanor. Inside, he felt a quiet thrill. This was the most she had said to him at once. She had let something of herself slip, a glimpse into her life before this moment. He forced himself to remain composed, as though her words didn't matter more to him than they should. "That's good," he said casually, though his heartbeat quickened. "I think I'd like to taste your cooking then." The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of discomfort, uncertainty. He realized too late how his words might have sounded, as though he were asking for more than he intended. A date, another meeting. To his simultaneous relief and dismay, she quickly changed the subject. "How's your wound?" she asked, her tone brisk and clinical. "It's fine," he replied without missing a beat, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I'm not in pain at the moment. I suppose the pain earlier was just hunger." Her lips twitched faintly, but she said nothing. He let the moment settle before continuing. "It's fine, really," he added. "I'll take a look at it myself later." It honestly wasn't a problem. The earlier adrenaline, he supposed, was still doing its thing. She nodded, her fingers resuming their nervous twisting. "So, your mother must be a chef then?" Obasi asked, tilted his head, studying her. Nasha's gaze was hesitant as it flickered toward him. "Yes," she said after a long pause, shaking her head slightly. Her voice grew quieter. She's no longer here." The weight of her words hit him instantly. He understood without her saying more, the hollow tone in her voice revealing a guarded pain. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice low and sincere. She nodded again, her lips pressed together. The silence between them stretched, the faint sound of rain outside filling the space. Obasi resolved to tread lightly, his curiosity swelling. He longed to know her, who she was, why she was here, where she came from, but he sensed she wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. Leaning forward, his tone was gentle yet probing as he stated, "You're afraid of the dark." Nasha's heart constricted as Obasi's words echoed in the quiet, a grim refrain that brought back the haunting whispers of darkness from when she was 6, when nightfall meant danger and despair. In that moment, his statement stirred memories of endless, terror-filled nights, and her pulse raced with a raw, familiar dread. Her eyes flickered to him, and in their brief meeting, her brows knitted in silent turmoil. She began, but the words died on her tongue. Instead, she clutched a fold of her dress, her fingers trembling like delicate leaves in a storm. Obasi paused, letting the heavy silence stretch between them before gently pressing. Why? Her head snapped up, hazel eyes narrowing into a fragile shield of defiance. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might speak, to reveal the depths of a fear she had carried for far too long. The memory of being trapped in a dark, unyielding room where her screams had gone unanswered still clung to her. A wound that had never fully closed. But then she only shook her head, her lips parting as though on the verge of confession, before falling silent once more. It wasn't the answer he'd hoped for, yet in that tentative quiet, he found a bittersweet solace. She was still here. Obasi decided to take a much lighter approach. He leaned forward, his tone gentle and careful. He didn't want to scare her or make her feel uncomfortable. "How old are you?" he asked softly. Nasha's eyes dropped, and in a timid, almost inaudible murmur she replied, 20. Her voice was so quiet it barely reached him. His mind raced, progress, he thought, while he fought to mask the excitement bubbling within him. He was right, he noted silently. His thoughts drifted to the moment in the art room, when her reaction to the sculpture had brought tears to her eyes. He longed to ask her why she'd reacted with such distress, but he couldn't reveal that the piece was his own creation. His question had to be subtle, unassuming, just enough to draw her out without arousing suspicion. Leaning forward slightly, his tone remained casual, yet laced with curiosity. "That sculpture you saw earlier, it seemed to affect you. Do you find it scary?" His expression stayed neutral, but his dark eyes never left hers, silently urging her to speak. For a long moment, Nasha hesitated. Then her gaze met his again, cautious but thoughtful. "It's not scary," she murmured. Obasi tilted his head, replying with a gentle, "Oh?" before pressing further. "Then why did you run from it?" At that, Nasha's head lifted in thought. For a fleeting instant, the pale light caught her face, revealing a reflective beauty that took his breath away. The contrast of her hazel eyes against her smooth, dark skin, the way the light caressed the delicate angles of her face. It was mesmerizing. Obasi's gaze remained locked on her, unable to look away, as the traces of fear in her features softened, replaced by an intensity that made her eyes sparkle. The shift was subtle, yet undeniable, and in that moment, it halted his heart. "It moved me," she began softly, not with fear, but with overwhelming pain. It was as if every detail, every curve, every line, spoke of a deep loss, of someone the artist once loved dearly. And yet, despite that sorrow, it's breathtaking, as though it took years to create. She paused, then added with measured restraint, "It reminded me of Ife art, the precision, the deliberate grace in every piece." You know about Ife art?" he managed, his voice laced with genuine intrigue and a hint of shock. Nasha's gaze dropped to her hand, her fingers subtly trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. She hesitated before meeting his eyes, then glanced away again. "Yes." Obasi responded swiftly, seizing the moment before the conversation could slip away. "Wow," he said, his voice carrying an encouraging warmth. "Most people your age overlook it. Art is often seen as boring, time-consuming. Social media holds all the appeal nowadays." "Oh," Nasha murmured. The bland response made Obasi wonder if he had lost her interest in the conversation, but then she shifted in her seat, her hands curling on her lap as she looked down for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I've always been interested in art," she said softly, her voice imbued with restrained sincerity. "Not just to look, but to understand it, what it's saying, what it makes you feel. In this mansion, every piece feels alive, as if they breathe. Each one tells a story about love, change, devotion. It's incredible." Nasha paused, her gaze lighting up as it drifted toward a small square carving nestled in the far, indistinct corner of the room. For a heartbeat she studied it, and Obasi felt a flicker of tension. He had placed it there deliberately, half hidden, out of sight from casual observers. And yet, she had found it. Her eyes traced its intricate details, lingering on the delicate grooves and careful etchings. Then, in a soft, unguarded tone, she said, "Every line, every curve, it's as if they hide a secret." Her voice grew even quieter, more thoughtful. Like the artist poured his heart into them, his loss, his hope, capturing it in stone and wood. "And it's not just this piece." She swallowed, her fingers curling slightly on her lap. "Every single one I've seen in this house feels the same. It's not just art, it's a piece of his soul." Obasi's heart pounded as her insight cut deep, sending a jolt through him. In that moment, he recalled how she would stand silently before the art scattered throughout the mansion, a strange reverence etched onto her face. One of the first things he'd noticed, watching her through the cameras, was her silent scrutiny. She never touched a piece, yet moved with deliberate caution, pausing often to gaze at the paintings on the walls or the statues lining the corridors. It was as if she saw something others could not, something beyond what was physically there. And now, as she spoke, her soft words laid bare the depth of her understanding. All this time, she could see into them. A sharp realization gripped him. Guests had passed through this house before, wealthy collectors and scholars alike, but none had seen the art like she did. No one. She observed with an intensity that made it seem as though she were reading the pieces like an open book, deciphering their unspoken stories, unearthing truths even their creator had buried. It unsettled him. This realization that she could see into his work with such startling clarity, peeling back the layers he had long believed impenetrable. His sculptures had always been a refuge, a place where he could exercise his grief without fear of being truly seen. He had carved his losses into stone, shaped his pain into form, never expecting, never wanting anyone to decode the silent language of his sorrow. Yet, here she was, reading him like an open book. It made his chest feel tight, as if something he had carefully locked away was being pried open against his will. Who was she? Where did she come from? And how? How could she peer so deeply into his work? His thoughts swelled, his pulse hammering as his gaze remained locked onto her, unsure if he wanted to push her away or pull her closer. In that moment, bathed in the dim glow of the room, she looked almost celestial, tremendously radiant, hauntingly captivating, as if she were a living vision of the divine. And then, he watched as the luminous openness in her eyes faded. Her gaze drifted back to him, and in that instant, as if startled by her own candor, her features tightened with self-consciousness. The openness from moments before was replaced by a guarded mask, caution mingled with a sudden surge of fear and regret. Nasha studied his intense expression, terrified that he might deduce the truth, that she wasn't meant to be here at all, that she had broken in and was, in fact, an intruder in this sanctuary. "Oh God," she thought, "I've said too much." Her mind raced back to how she had spoken of the art, as if she were seeing it for the first time, when someone who belonged here would never reveal such wonder. Her eyes fixed on him, her heart pounding with uncertainty. How had she let her guard fall so completely? For a fleeting moment her gaze darted toward the window, a desperate thought of escape if her secret were to be exposed. "I think it's wonderful that you know so much about art," Obasi said gently, regaining his composure and softening his tone. "It's a rare gift, one you should nurture." Relief surged through her. Thank goodness, he hadn't noticed. Her secret was safe, at least for now. That had been too close. For a moment, she feared he'd realize something was amiss. She knew she had to be more careful. Quickly, she reminded herself of the objective: get him out of here so she could finally leave. She observed that his pain had eased, his posture now straight and resolute. The food had worked its magic, restoring his strength. A fleeting thought urged her to ask him to see a doctor again, as a pretext for sending him away, but guilt quickly silenced it. Outside, the rain had escalated from a gentle patter to a relentless downpour. Nasha shuddered slightly, the memories creeping in. On a night like this, she would have been out there, huddled beneath some crooked or makeshift shelter, the cold slicing through her skin like a blade. If she were lucky, no one would notice her. No angry voices telling her to leave, no one chasing her off their property like a nuisance. Leaving tonight wasn't an option. This was better, even if only for now. Warm, dry, not hungry. A fleeting comfort, but still comfort. The thought of leaving twisted inside her, bittersweet and unshakable. Her gaze drifted to Obasi, lingering on him longer than she intended. In truth, it was almost over. Just one more night. She only had to get him through this one night, and by morning, she would convince him to seek help. Then, finally, she would be free. Free. But the word felt hollow. Free to go where? The thought curled coldly in her chest, tighter than she expected. Out there, the world was still the same, merciless, empty, waiting to swallow her whole. The streets hadn't grown softer, the cold hadn't grown kinder. And by now, there were worse things lurking in the dark than him. Worse things than this sofa, this moment, this man who, despite everything, had never lifted a hand against her. Not once. Her eyes drifted over the firm lines of his silhouette, the quiet strength in his stillness. Not even once. But his gaze, steady, unreadable, holding, watching. She flinched, pulse tightening. Not yet. The thought sliced through her, stark and unrelenting. In that brief moment, she realized he had been watching her, unblinking, as she drifted into thought. Her pulse jumped, but before she could gauge the meaning behind his stare, his expression softened. "I truly admire your passion for art," he murmured, his tone gentle, reaffirming the depth of her insight. After a pause, her lips pressed together, and then she spoke, each word delicate, as if voicing them aloud might shatter something fragile. "I want to be a sculptor. Someday. I want to go to art school, learn everything I can." At those words, her hazel eyes ignited, a sudden, unmistakable fire flashing within them, so vivid, so alive, that it nearly stopped Obasi's breath. His chest tightened, a slow, measured inhale the only thing keeping him grounded. He had spent years surrounded by art, but no masterpiece had ever struck him like this moment, like the brilliance in her gaze, raw and unguarded, burning with a passion too fierce to be silenced. "And one day, I'd like to own my own art museum." The gravity of her declaration struck him with an unexpected force once again. Obasi leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on her as if he were seeing her for the first time. He was stunned, not merely by her aspirations, but by the raw honesty of her dream. There she sat, guarded yet vulnerable, her vision so profound it resonated with his own secret life, a life defined by the museum he had painstakingly built over the years. Her words echoed in his mind, each syllable a revelation. She wasn't just fleeing the shadows, she was a beacon of potential and passion, her dreams unfolding with a clarity that both startled and awed him. Obasi swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain composed. His emotions churned just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over, but he dared not let them show. At least, not yet. clearing his throat softly, his voice emerged low and steady, anchoring the moment with quiet resolve. "That's quite the dream," he said finally, his words slow and deliberate. His gaze remained on her, unwavering. "And I think it suits you." For a moment, Nasha's guarded expression flickered. Then, without warning, a small, brilliant smile broke across her face, a quick flash of white that transformed her features. It was the first time he had seen her smile in his presence, and for that brief instant, every anxious thought he'd harbored unraveled. Even as it faded, the remnants of it lingered in her eyes, in the hesitant curve at the corners of her lips. She blinked, something shifting in her gaze, something cautious, yet no longer entirely wary, a delicate kind of hope. But she said nothing, only pressed her hands lightly against her lap, as though grounding herself in the moment. Obasi let the silence stretch, his chest tightening with a force he hadn't braced for. Every subtle nuance in her expression, a fleeting smile, the gentle lift of her eyelids, the subtle shift in her breathing, struck him in potent pulses. He had never been this attuned to someone before, never felt the weight of a single expression settle so deeply into his being. His fingers flexed slightly where they rested against his thigh, his breath slowing, as if steadying something unraveling inside him. And that smile. A quick, delicate flicker, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Yet it landed like the first drop of rain before a storm, small, fleeting, but enough to send a ripple through him. His pulse skipped, his thoughts momentarily wiped clean. What was that? The effect was disproportionate, stunning, dangerous. He wasn't even sure what startled him more, the way his body responded, or the quiet realization that he wanted to see it again. His gaze remained locked on her, drawn to the lingering trace of that smile still resting on her lips, to the way she suddenly seemed softer, more open. Something in his chest shifted, a quiet warning, insidious and unshakable. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, but the feeling didn't fade. It settled deep, curling into the spaces he had long kept guarded. She had softened before him, just a little, but the moment felt precarious, like the flicker of a candle in the wind. A single breath could extinguish it. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to keep her engaged, to keep her talking. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he spoke. "So?" His voice was measured, careful. "Besides art, what do you like to do?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a second, her brows knitted as if she had to consider whether she even had an answer. Then, with a small shrug, she murmured, "I don't know. I've never really thought about it." The honesty of it struck him. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to sound interesting. The way she said it, it was as if no one had ever asked her before. Before he could decide whether or not to press, she tilted her head, those hazel eyes locking onto him. "What about you?" she asked, the question feeling unexpectedly direct. "What do you like to do?" Obasi stilled. A simple question, but for the first time in the conversation, he felt unprepared. What did he like to do? Art. The answer was so obvious it almost felt ridiculous. It was his life, his air, his blood. But suddenly, saying that to her felt dangerous. She already seemed so withheld, cautious, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. The last thing he wanted was for her to think he was mirroring her in some hollow attempt to impress her. He hesitated. "I sing." The words left him before he could fully think them through. Nasha's lips parted slightly in surprise. Not suspicion. Interest. "You sing?" she echoed, tilting her head. There was something about the way she looked at him, curious, unguarded, that made him curse internally. He had not thought this through, Not for a second. Yeah, he muttered, already regretting it. She straightened slightly. Sing something, then. Obasi's stomach twisted. Now he really regretted it. She was looking at him expectantly, her hands curling around the fabric of her dress, as if bracing herself to listen. Her eyes gleamed under the light, and it was so unfair how effortlessly captivating she was. How a simple request from her suddenly had him out of his depth. He ran a hand over his jaw, suddenly feeling unsteady. I have no idea what to sing. Her lips twitched. Do you know Kulo-sa? He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head at her choice. Yes, I know it. Sing that. Obasi could not sing to save his life, and yet she was watching him so intently, waiting. He had not sung in over 12 years. Not a note, not a tune. His voice had once belonged to another life, a different version of himself, one that felt like a ghost now. But this girl, she had asked. And so, with no escape, no excuse, no reason to say no, Obasi let out a slow breath and did something he never thought he would do again. He started to sing. The moment the words left his lips, her head snapped up. And then she burst into laughter. A bright, bird-like laugh, sharp and sudden, spilling out before she could stop it. Obasi froze. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes widening as though startled by her own reaction. But it was too late. The sound had already rushed through him like a wildfire, unraveling something deep in his chest. She was laughing at him, and he should have been embarrassed. He was, but God, her laughter. He had never heard anything like it, not from her. Not that light, not that free, like sunlight slipping through cracks in heavy clouds. His pulse thundered, and all at once he was ruined. Because this girl, who barely smiled, who carried the weight of ghosts in her eyes, was laughing. And it was because of him. He had done that. For a second, he forgot his own humiliation, forgot the way his voice had cracked on the second note, forgot everything except the way she looked right now. Her shoulders shook, her eyes crinkled at the corners, and that small, delicate hand remained clamped over her mouth, like she was trying to hold it in, to contain herself, but couldn't. Obasi could only stare. Even as the laughter faded into quiet giggles, even as she composed herself, dropping her hand and glancing at him with a sheepish expression, he couldn't look away. That was, she exhaled, biting her lip to suppress another laugh. That was terrible. Obasi huffed a breath, half scandalized, half entranced. I know. She shook her head, still fighting a smile. Like, really bad. Obasi tilted his head slightly, watching her, still caught in the aftershock of what had just happened, of what he had just seen. The sound of her laughter still echoed in his head, in his chest, in his very bones. He should have been embarrassed. He wasn't. Because God help him, he would sing 1,000 more terrible notes just to hear her laugh again.